The Edmonton Oilers acquired Jake Walman from the San Jose Sharks last week ahead of the NHL trade deadline. What does the veteran defenseman bring to the Oilers that they so desperately needed? All on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's show, a full-on deep dive into Jake Walman, who the Oilers acquired from the San Jose Sharks late last week. We're going to start with the profile, the amateur pedigree, drafted, the road to get here. We'll pivot. We'll talk a little bit about the underlying numbers, get an understanding of how Walman impacts play, and we'll tie a bow on it by diving into what I think is the appropriate setting or fit for Walman with the Oilers. So, Walman is amongst the newer archetype of NHL defensemen. And a player like Walman 5 or 10 years ago is probably peaking out as a third pair defenseman. And that's no fault of his own. It's just where the game happened to be a couple of years ago. We have underseen a massive transition in terms of offensive impacts from the back end over the last half decade. And you think about where we were as a league 10 years ago and the quality of offense, how defensemen impacted it, the Norris Trophy conversations being dominated by guys like Erik Karlsson, PK Subban, Victor Hedman, late career Chara, some Shea Weber in there occasionally. But for the most part, it was a bit more of a low-scoring environment. It was more difficult for teams to score, and NHL organizations were reluctant to pivot towards leaning at offense. And what I mean by that, and this is a conversation I've had a lot over the last few weeks, when you think about guys like Evan Bouchard, Miro Heiskanen, Adam Fox, Quinn Hughes, Noah Dobson for that matter, those offense-first defensemen whose best assets are being a component in transition, helping their team switch from defense to offense quickly, moving the puck, contributing as a fourth offensive player in the offensive zone, they typically struggle at the net front. Even guys like Jake Walman, who are 6'1", someone like Evan Bouchard, who's over 6 foot, Noah Dobson's over 6 foot, Keandre Miller, another player who comes to mind as being over that 6'1" benchmark, but doesn't particularly throw his body around. And Walman is willing to throw his body around. That's not really the point I'm trying to make here. But by and large, these offense-first defensemen who drive possession or have the skill sets to help drive possession are a relatively new emerging position group, and some teams are very reluctant to play more than one or two of these guys in their lineup. There are some organizations that have guys who absolutely are one of their 6 best defensemen, but they opt for a little bit lower ceiling and a little bit of a higher floor with defensemen who are probably a little bit more well-rounded and skew towards defense first, more willing to block shots, more willing to throw their bodies around. And that brings us to Jake Walman, who was drafted in the 3rd round by the St. Louis Blues quite a while ago at this point. And when you think about the trajectory of being a 3rd round pick way back in 2014, he only has 253 career NHL games played as a 29-year-old. And some of that is by virtue of what we've discussed, the offense-first skill set that scares some teams that feel, well, if he can't quarterback our first power play unit, and we don't want a guy who's not an NHL player running our first power play, because we want that to go to our best defenseman. We want our best defenseman to run our first power play unit. That way, we can juice their counting stats a little bit. That way, when contract time comes and we have to negotiate, they're going to say, well, we run the power play for you. We produce points. You're going to want me in this role. And for someone like Walman, he wasn't ever going to leapfrog an Alex Pietrangelo, a Colton Parayko in St. Louis out of the gate. So that meant he was starting lower in the pecking order. Then he goes to Detroit. Mo Seider, significantly more important to Detroit's long-term trajectory. And then you get to this past season, or should I say the first 50 games of the 24-25 season, and Walman's playing the most minutes he's ever played in an entire season at 23-11. So 23-11 per game, getting almost 3 full minutes per game on the power play while killing penalties as well. And this brings us to something we discussed last week on the show, the idea of role efficiency and where you slide in. On a bad team, and we talked about this in the context of Jeff Skinner last week, that on a bad Sabres team, he was able to get 2.5, 3 minutes per game on the power play. At 5-on-5, he was playing with Tage Thompson and Alex Tuch, solely with the mindset of we need to score, we need to score, we need to score. I don't care about the defense. And for Jake Walman in San Jose, similar problem here. On an atrocious defensive team, the Sharks give up high danger chances at one of the highest rates in the entire NHL. Walman's out there to help facilitate as much offensive creation from the back end as he can. One of the real conundrums or challenges for the Sharks over the next handful of seasons is going to be finding defensemen to supplement the young guys like Will Smith, like Macklin Celebrini, like William Eklund, who to varying degrees have all showed quite a bit of promise, but having a few forwards is nice. You need defensemen who are well-rounded, who can play good defense, and who can help drive offense. And it puts us in a position now where Walman is going to slide probably a little lower in the lineup. I know on Monday morning at practice, they had Walman playing with Bouchard. They're not sure what the deal is with Ekholm, how much longer he's going to be out, when he's going to be available. We'll talk about in the third segment where I think Walman ultimately ends up sliding in when the defense is fully healthy. But this is a player who doesn't have a huge NHL track record to go by for someone who's already going to be 29 years old. And that leaves you, I don't want to say weary, but I don't think Jake Walman's ever played. Jake Walman has one career NHL playoff game under his belt, which was with the Blues in 2020, 2021 as a 24-year-old. And you'll be weary of the offense first defenseman who lacks a playoff pedigree in the playoffs, because the Oilers, that's where they're going, and the goal is to win the Stanley Cup. And generally speaking, teams that win the Stanley Cup, their defensemen have a lot of games played, not just in the postseason, but overall. It's going to be very rare. It's very rare to find defensemen who have less than 300 games. Even 300 games played isn't that many, and it's very rare to find defensemen unless they're a superstar talent like a Cale Makar or a Bowen Byram, at least when he was drafted. It's very rare for guys with that profile of games played to be on a Stanley Cup winning team, because experience is so invaluable on that back end. But there are late bloomers. There are guys who get better as they emerge and find a role that suits them better, or relocate and get to a team that puts them in a position to succeed. So we're not ruling out the potential for Jake Walman being an impactful Oiler over the next season and change, but it is questionable. And it does leave you on the outside looking in thinking, he's already 29. He doesn't have a lot of games played. He's only been to the playoffs once. Is this really the type of guy who's going to be able to be successful on the Oilers? We're going to talk a little bit more about Jake Walman on the other side of the break, so be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Did you just realize your business needed to hire someone like yesterday? How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs. Put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. We've all been in that spot where we need the right hire for our team like yesterday. The pressure's on, and every day without the right person is a setback. That's exactly when Indeed sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. Now, you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored jobs credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we're breaking down Jake Walman's NHL career to this point, what he brings to the Oilers, and the value of someone with this skill set. So I enjoy doing these player evaluations because they help me look at the context of a player and help me understand what are reasonable expectations, because a lot of people will look at the goals, the assists, maybe the shooting percentage and the save percentage. And that's really the end of the conversation. They don't talk about how much they're used, who they play with, the quality of competition, zone starts, and what are reasonable expectations based on all of that context. And there are a lot of environmental factors that can drive individual player success. As we've discussed a whole lot here on Locked On Oilers, the single most indicative statistic for eventual counting stat production is time on ice. You got to be out on the ice to contribute. And when we reduce the game down to its most simple form, goals for and goals against, the more you're out there, the more opportunities there are in both directions. For someone like Jake Walman, who plays power play, who kills penalties, there's ample opportunity to materially influence the outcome and direction of a game. And someone with Walman's skill set, a strong skater, over 6 feet tall, above average puck skills for a defenseman, all of that combined would explain a lot of why the Sharks were willing to throw as much ice time at him as he could possibly handle this year. Because you think about where the Sharks are at in the NHL pecking order. They're towards the bottom of the entire league. That's a team that's going to struggle defensively. So instead of trying to slow the game down and try and lumber their way into some rock fights, the Sharks' supposition and their calculus is, if we can't defend anyway, one guy is not going to make a whole lot of difference. So instead, let's focus on trying to create as much offense as possible. That way we're not just wasting the time of William Eklund, of a Macklin Celebrini, of a Will Smith. Because eventually we are going to have a better defense. But we don't want to waste 2 years of development for our young guys on rock fight defensemen who can't handle the puck at all. And when you have defensemen who are good handlers of the puck, who can contribute, transitioning your team from defense to offense and quickly, because they're good skaters, because they can get in the position they need to make plays, because of the fact that they're going to often be deployed with the team's best forwards to augment offense as much as possible. And we see that across the board in the NHL. We see that with the Oilers. Evan Bouchard plays the majority of his minutes with Connor McDavid. Adam Fox plays the majority of his minutes with Artemi Panarin. Charlie McAvoy with David Pasternak. Quinn Hughes with Elias Pettersson. It goes on and on. There is a material benefit in playing your best puck-moving defenseman with your best forwards, because those two facets of the game are interconnected. The less defense you play, the more offense you're going to play. And that's really been the conundrum, if you will, once you get past Evan Bouchard this year. And I don't think Bouchard has been as outstanding as he was last year. I think last year Bouchard was a top 10 defenseman in the NHL. I think he was arguably the best defenseman in the entire playoffs last year, either him or Gus Forsling of the Florida Panthers. And what makes Bouchard so effective, and to a lesser extent for Walman as well, having the skating ability to be where you need to be. And this might ruffle some feathers, what I'm about to say. You don't need to be able to throw your body through someone if you can be in the right place at the right time. Because when you line someone up and you throw that big hit, you are taking yourself out of position to continue the play. Because even if you clean the guy and knock him off his feet, the puck is still up for grabs. You have not changed possession. Materially, your goal as a hockey player, if you are throwing a check, should be to force a change in possession, to force the other team to either pass the puck, turn the puck over, or move the puck along in hopes of your team being able to go out and get there. So the fact that Jake Walman does not throw a lot of hits, he's credited with 212 hits in his NHL career through the course of 253 NHL games. That's less than a hit per game. This is not someone who is going to fill the void that you might think they're missing from Cody Ceci or Vincent Desharnais from last year's team. But what I do think Walman has the capacity to help with is lightening the load on Bouchard and Ekholm. And he's going to play in different spots. I'm very curious to see how the Oilers and how Chris Knoblauch opts to deploy Walman, Klingberg, Emberson, Stetcher when they have a full coffer of guys to pick through. I know I said earlier that Monday during practice they were starting with Walman with Bouchard, lefty-righty. Makes sense. I think when Ekholm comes back and he feels better, there's a strong argument to play Walman on his offside with Darnell Nurse, and then you run Kulak and Emberson or Kulak and Klingberg as your third pair, because no matter what, Nurse, Walman, Ekholm, Bouchard, Kulak, no matter what, those five guys are playing. I struggle to envision a world where even Brett Kulak would be considered to be a healthy scratch candidate in favor of one of the other guys. And I think John Klingberg can get better, and I've talked about this quite a bit over the last week or so, that the Oilers don't owe John Klingberg a lot. They're not paying him a lot of money. He's not a long-term proposition, but I do understand the curiosity there. I do understand Chris Knoblauch and by extension Stan Bowman wanting to see if there's any hockey left in John Klingberg before we get to the playoffs, because if there's a world where Klingberg can be materially impactful, especially in terms of going from defense to offense, and you can roll him out on your third pair with Brett Kulak, and you can take advantage of his puck skills and his skating, that sounds really good to me. But we'll talk more about the fit and where I think he makes sense in the lineup in our next segment. I just want to tie a bow on this, because when you look at a player like Jake Walman, who's been on pretty bad teams for the chunk of his NHL career, 2 years in St. Louis, 3 years in Detroit, 1 year in San Jose, he's never really been on a great team. He's always had some interesting responsibilities, is the way I would describe it. 2 years ago, 41% of his quality of competition was elite. Last year in Detroit, it was 44%. This past year in San Jose, the first 50 games of the regular season, a little more reasonable, down at 33% for the year. But he was also the Sharks' most commonly used defenseman this year in the first 50 games of the Sharks season. So I think if you dial his responsibilities back just a smidge, you dial back his minutes just a hair, the underlying numbers are reasonable. Chances for, shots for, the expected goals and the high danger chances are definitely a little bit concerning, but I do think it's worth pointing out the teams he's been on the last few years are atrocious defensively, and there's only so much one guy can do. Like we said before, he's most commonly being deployed with those teams' best offensive players, so he's not really being told to worry about defense. It's more about do whatever you can to help our offense, because one guy is not going to save our defense. We're going to take one more final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day, and we're going to talk about where Jake Walman slides in this lineup for now and come playoff time. Be right back. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets. For me, I love March Madness. Whether you're an underdog guy, a chalk guy, FanDuel makes it easy to back whoever you got with spreads, totals, and individual game props. With tournament games happening Thursday through Sunday for the next several weeks, there's always something exciting to bet on. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when you win, you get paid out instantly. No waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. And thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we make our way through our Jake Walman deep dive. And I don't know what I make of Jake Walman on a good team. He's never been on one as a serious NHLer. He had a cup of coffee on a St. Louis Blues team that made the playoffs 4 years ago. And when you're going from minutes eater on a bad team to a bit more of a specialized role on a good team with championship aspirations, it can take you a little while to figure out what that's going to mean for your career and what the team is going to do with you. And I like the addition in the abstract. I think Walman definitely has a skill set that the Oilers are dearth of. They just don't have a lot of puck movers on the back ends. Even when Darnell Nurse is doing a good job in transition, it's often because he himself is using his skating ability to get the puck out of danger. Whereas when you think about Bouchard and to some degree Walman, it's that good first pass. It's that stretch pass that's 30 to 40 feet from close to the net towards the blue line to facilitate going from one end of the ice to the other. And when you drop someone with this skill set into a team with a high expectation and a high standard, I do think it's reasonable to expect some growing pains. Someone like Walman, I think, can absolutely draw the ire of Chris Knoblauch. We've seen how Knoblauch has handled Jeff Skinner and other forwards to a lesser extent when their defense hasn't been up to snuff. So even if Walman does have a positive impact offensively, I would not be surprised to see the occasional skipped, words are hard sometimes, I apologize, or finding himself ending up on the third pair at points as equally as I could see him playing some minutes with Evan Bouchard. But I think most importantly, and the reason I like this fit maybe a little bit more than, say, some others, is the simple fact you could probably slide him in anywhere and he would be just fine. I think Walman can give you plenty as far as being an offense driver from the back end as he can be a competent defender. I don't think he's ever going to be a great defensive defenseman. He just doesn't profile that way. Like I said, less than one hit per game for his NHL career at 29 years old. That's not exactly Scott Stevens. And you don't need to be Scott Stevens to be effective anymore in today's NHL. I think a lot of people lose sight of the fact that the game has changed, that it has evolved, and the demands of the defenseman position are ever changing. They are fluid, and on an Oilers team that maybe to some degree lacks a bit of tenacity, a bit of grit, there might have been a bit more of an appetite from some for someone in the David Savard or maybe Rasmus Ristolainen mold of defensemen who are a bit more defensive skewed, who might be able to bring the temperature of a game down, especially in light of the way the Oilers have played defense over the last 2 to 3 weeks and what that's done to the team's goaltending. And when you have volatile goaltending like Jeff Skinner and Calvin Pickard, there is, that devil on your shoulder that's going to whisper low impact defensemen, low event games. Let's try and just dumb the game down, reduce the overall number of scoring chances in the game, and let's let our star players be the difference between winning and losing. And I do think it's a good sign that the Oilers opted for someone with some upside like a Jake Walman as opposed to going the Savard or Rasmus Ristolainen or even a Ryan Lindgren tier of defender who, sure, they can block shots and defend. They also aren't great handlers of the puck. And I think fundamentally that's something that sticks in my mind from last year's postseason in regards to the Oilers, was just that when they were struggling, when Florida, especially in the Cup final, and Florida's a great team, don't get me wrong. I think Florida is the Stanley Cup favorite as we sit here right now in early March. And Florida gets you in your own zone. They grind you into a pulp. You can't move the puck at all. You're constantly turning it over or just looking for an outlet to reduce the temperature of the play. And adding another guy who can meaningfully move the puck will make a difference. Now, is Jake Walman going to be the difference between the Oilers winning and losing the Stanley Cup? No. This is the tier of player that slides in below the guys who are the difference between winning and losing. Sure. Could the Oilers have used a little more depth? Absolutely. You can never have enough depth. Like we talk about all the time on Locked On Oilers, you're going to go through 8 or 9 defensemen on the way to a Stanley Cup final. You're probably going to go through 15 or 16 forwards on the way to a Stanley Cup final. It can never hurt to have enough depth. You want to have a diversity of skill sets in your lineup where you have some good puck movers, you have some good zone deniers, you have some good chance creators. You want to have a little bit of everything. That way, when your coach is in the fire and they got to make decisions, they have tools at their disposal. They have a range of outcomes. They have the capacity to try and match up what's going to work best for what you need. If you're chasing a goal, you can run Walman and Bouchard out there. If you're trying to defend the lead, you'll probably run Bouchard and Ekholm out there. If you want to try and get a little more offense somewhere, you're probably going to run Nurse with Walman on his offside, and you're going to get them out there with Leon if Leon and Connor aren't together. I think if you're late, the longer we go in the season, I think in an ideal world, if you need a goal, you're probably going to see Walman with Bouchard and then Connor, Leon, and Hyman. Who the sixth person would be in that context, I don't know. Probably Ryan, probably Nuge, but I'm not positive. It could be someone else. And the Oilers have, on paper, I would say, a better defensive group than they did in last year's Cup final. And a lot of that is contingent, I should say, on Matthias Ekholm's health. I want to be fair, knowing that Ekholm's been hurt and sick on more than one occasion this season, and that's definitely having an impact on his performance. So Ekholm's health is very important to the overall direction of the Oilers. He's probably their sixth most important player on the entire team. And if Ekholm can't be himself, that only increases the burden of responsibility on Jake Walman going forward, because if he's going to slide in at points with Evan Bouchard and he's playing with Connor McDavid, you got to be on your P's and Q's, because the Oilers can't be wasting those minutes. The Connor McDavid minutes with Evan Bouchard are the Oilers' most important minutes on a night-to-night basis, because those are the minutes the Oilers are expecting to control the flow of the game and chip in goals pretty much once a game. And that might sound crazy to say you expect Connor McDavid to contribute to at least a goal a game, but between the goals he scores, the goals he facilitates, and the chances he creates, it's almost academic that he's going to end up with a point almost every night just by virtue of the way he plays and how much he touches the puck. But in summation, you should be cautiously optimistic about Jake Walman and what he brings to the Oilers. He's not quite a first pair guy on a good team, but we're going to see what he can do on a good team for the first time in his NHL career. Maybe he's a late bloomer, and this opportunity, he takes the bull by the horns and cements himself as a first pair left-handed defenseman. He rides shotgun with Bouchard. Ekholm and Nurse form more of a traditional shutdown second pair. And by virtue of that, the entire defense gets better because everyone slides down a spot. That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please throw the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes out. Thank you to everyone who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On NHL podcast covering the biggest stories all across the league with all of Locked On's local flavor. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers. Cool. Okay.